I'm going to do a SAM build and a deploy. And this will just confirm all those parameters. And I'm going to say confirm changes before deploy. Yes. So we can take a look at what's actually getting created. So let's build this. And let's go to CloudFormation all the way to the top, change set. Let's click on this change set and see what we're getting created. So we're adding a record. This is a Route 53 record set. And that's only because we're creating a subdomain. We're creating a certificate for a subdomain. We're creating the domain name and for API, custom domain. And we're also doing a mapping. And this is how we're mapping our custom domain name to our API. So let's go ahead and just deploy this. So let's see if we're getting any error. We're seeing some error. Let's take a look at what's going on with our stack. Refresh and let's look at our events. And let's see. Return mess invalid domain name, identifier. So we're getting some error, but we'll fix those. Not found exception. So we may have. So let's see. So for HTTP API map, it's saying it can't find the domain, invalid domain name. So let's see what we have there. And this is still running. So let's take a look. HTTP map. So we are doing a reference. Reference subdomain, reference stage. This looks correct. Let's move up to our domain record. And let's make sure this is the correct. Yep, that is correct. And we're also referencing the full qualifying subdomain. So let's take a look at that. That is correct as well. Type is a record. We have an alias target. Get attribute for HTTP API domain. That is correct. Regional domain name. Hosted ID. That looks correct. Let's take a look at what's going on in our domain name. Maybe that's where the problem is. Domain name, reference subdomain. That is correct. Domain name configuration. We have our certificate on reference cert endpoint regional. Let's look at our certificate as well. Reference subdomain, reference hosted ID, and of type DNS. So our code does look fine. So we can see that our error is pretty much locked into API map. And it's the same error. So oftentimes with these resources, right, when you're creating multiple resources, the order in which they're created may be or may be a problem or may not be a problem. And I think in this case, it's not actually finding a domain name, so it's not getting created in time. So what we may need to do, and this is just a nifty flag that CloudFormation or SAM as, is we can do a depends on. and we'll say HTTP API domain, which means this resource needs to be created prior to the mapping. And even though the order sometimes doesn't dictate which one gets created, AWS really looks at these resources and decide the order. So let's clear this. Sam build. And let's try to push this up again. And let's see if these resources are getting created. So if we go in certificate manager, we should see a second cert, and it's pending validation. The cool thing is this will actually create a CNAME for us. Once that CNAME, so let's see if the A record gets created yet, and that was still running. And this may take a few minutes, but we haven't seen any failures yet, so that's a good sign. And if we go back to cert, this validation process, what it's doing is it's just trying to make sure ownership is there for the domain. And this, we should see this CNAME get populated in the hosted zone. So already we're seeing 8 records, which is pretty in line. That means, let's just take a look at what the cert is. So it's the E59. We haven't seen that yet. So we have a couple resources getting created. We can also probably check in our custom domains. And there we are. So the custom domain is getting created and it's being mapped to our API. So we are making progress. This is still going through the validation process. And it is successful, which means this CNAME should be showing up in our hosted zone section as well. And we now have 9 records, so we should have 2 A record, which is pretty cool. So we have an A record for URL, we have a CNAME for our cert, and that should pretty much give us everything we need to start using this custom domain on our API. So let's just wait for this stack to complete. Here we go. So we're all in green. Let's go back to our domain and let's close some of these. So we have a new A record. We have a CNAME that maps to that A record or domain. So we can close this. And if we go to our API, we also have a new custom domain that maps to our API. And if we look at API, it maps to the stage as well. So this is pretty cool, right? So let's actually try to test this ourselves. So if we grab this domain, or if we go back to our APIs, let me close this so we make sure we're on the same page. And let's go to our resources. And we're going to open up our service API. Of course, we're still going to see the invoke URL. We're still going to see the routes. However, if we go to custom domains, we should see the configuration. And this is saying URL that beams, and it does have the mapping to our API at the stage. Let's actually test this out. So if we open Postman, I am going to do a post on create URL. And let me just copy this JSON body. And let's do a raw JSON. And make sure we actually put in the complete domain name. And there we go. And we probably need to make some update to our code, all right? We are still using a dev stage. We should actually update the stage to prod. And so our domain should just be HTTPS, the domain name slash the actual resource. So let's copy that before we make that minor change. And let's just see if this works. And that's because we no longer need the stage, but let's activate our code. And that should wrap up our URL shortener. So let's go to create. And if you remember, we have a check for stage. It is still saying dev. So we need to update that to, let's say, prod. And this is our production version. So we're going to save. We're going to do a SAM build. And we're going to deploy. And if you're running into problems like these, one thing we can check is the toml file, because it does save some of the predefined parameters, and there it is. It's still as dev, so we can actually change this here, or we can delete this. All you need to do is make sure you're creating the stack with the same name, and that should be it. So we're just going to manually change this to this match the stage name that we have in our template. We're going to do another build. And that error just says that CloudFormation looks at our stack and it doesn't see any changes that require a build of the project. All right, which is a bit weird, but that's what it's seen. So let's just see if we can override that. And I think we ran into that same stage error we had before. Invalid stage identifier. Okay. So we're seeing somewhat of a quirk with our code, right? The and that has to do with the check that we have here and the continuous update of the stage variable. One thing we could do is totally remove the checks altogether and keep our code just to use the URL without the stage. That's actually the working version of our code, right? We were trying to accommodate for both scenarios, and that poses a problem since we can also maybe do an additional checks. There's other things we can look at, right? If we look at resource, and let's just open up our function, and that's okay. Let's go to monitor. And I'm just going to open CloudWatch. So there's a few other properties we can set or look at to make sure we're running locally. We're running our dev version versus production. So if we open up our JSON there, and let's just go to JSON formatter, right? So we already know that we already know what our domain name is. So we can always check the host and say if the host doesn't match the URL that we have or it doesn't have the domain.com, then it's not prod. So there's quite a few things instead of checking the stage, which forces us to actually update the stage as we push. I think we'll probably just check the hosts. If the host doesn't match our domain, we will we can identify that it's running in dev mode, and if it has the domain name then it's production, and that should work. So let's do that in our next video, and that will finalize a working version of our URL shortener.